The night they locked me in a cell, my federal badge sat in a plastic evidence bag on the booking officer's desk, just 3 feet away, clearly visible through the scratched plexiglass divider. Officer Granger had held it up like a curious trinket, turning it over under the fluorescent light. He squinted at the gold deputy marshal star the way a man squints at a check he suspects will bounce, then tossed it into the evidence tray with a small, indifferent clatter. "We'll sort this out in the morning," he said, and he did not look at me when he spoke. By morning he would no longer have a job to come back to. Neither would 14 of his colleagues, but none of that existed yet. There was only the orange-lit cell, the sharp chemical smell of industrial cleaner, and the sound of my own breathing in the dark dot. My name is Malcolm Reed. I was a 12-year veteran deputy United States Marshal with the Eastern Seaboard District. I had walked out of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe at 29, with a badge that felt heavier than I expected and a sense of purpose that felt exactly right. In those 12 years, I had transported high-value federal fugitives across 6 states in the dead of night. I had stood inside federal courtrooms where defendants commanded more legal resources than most small municipalities. I had coordinated with FBI tactical units, the Secret Service, and every other alphabet agency the government had ever created. I knew federal statute the way a pianist knows a keyboard, not by reading, but by feel, by the precise weight of each provision and what breaks when you strike the wrong one too hard. I had never been on the wrong side of a cell door in my life. None of that mattered on the night I found myself in the parking lot of a Marriott in Belleville, Georgia. I had driven down from Atlanta that afternoon for what should have been the most routine assignment on my calendar. A federal witness named Lamar Quinn had been swept up on an unrelated local warrant and was sitting in the Belleville County Jail. My office had issued a federal detainer. My job was simple: arrive the next morning, complete the handoff paperwork with the county's marshal liaison, and transport Quinn back to Atlanta by midday. I had done this exact task nearly 200 times before, in different cities with different names. I checked into the Marriott in the late afternoon, confirmed the morning handoff by phone, changed out of my travel clothes, and walked across the 4-lane boulevard to a barbecue place I had spotted from the highway. Pulled pork, sweet tea, a slice of peach cobbler I didn't need but ordered anyway. It was the kind of meal that lingers cleanly in memory afterward, not because of its own quality, but because of what came next. The parking lot was nearly empty when I returned. The Georgia night hung warm and thick, the kind of warmth that settles into your clothes and stays there. Crickets sang from the tree line at the edge of the lot. Orange light spilled from the overhead lamps. My gym bag was over one shoulder, my room key in my right hand. I was 20 feet from the hotel entrance, already thinking about the shore waiting for me and the nothing I would watch on my laptop before sleep, when a cruiser came in fast with no lights and angled itself directly across my path. 2 officers got out. The taller one, Officer Ramsey, had his hand resting near his holster before he had fully straightened. I stopped. I kept my hands visible and my body completely still. I had been practicing that stillness since I was a teenager in Atlanta, the deliberate calm, the careful performance of non-threat that black men learn, not from any official training manual, but from the accumulated survival knowledge passed down like an inheritance nobody ever asked to receive. "Evening," I said. "Where are you coming from?" Ramsey asked. It was not a greeting. It was a command. "Dinner," I answered, nodding toward the restaurant across the street. "I'm a guest at the hotel here. Just coming back." Ramsey looked at the restaurant, then back at me. The second officer, Caldwell, 18 months on the job. 26 years old, was already moving to flank me. Something in the air shifted, the way it does before weather arrives. A pressure change, subtle and definitive. "Can I see some ID?" Caldwell said. I'm going to reach into my jacket slowly. I told them, clear and even. "I need to let you both know I'm a federal law enforcement officer, and I'm carrying a service weapon." That should have ended it. It always had before. Hands. Ramsey barked out. In the next instant, both men were on me. I was pressed against the hood of the cruiser before I had time to speak again. The metal was cold and hard against my cheek. One arm was wrenched high behind my back, the full weight of a man's hand driving between my shoulder blades. My gym bag hit the asphalt. My jacket was yanked open. My badge holder spilled out. The gold deputy marshal star and the federal ID card landed face up on the asphalt under the parking lot lights. Unmistakable. Right there. "I am a United States Marshal," I said into the metal of the hood. Each word pressed flat. "That badge on the ground is federal law enforcement identification. You need to call your supervisor right now." I felt one of them crouch. Heard the badge picked up. Heard fingers moving over the laminated card. "Could be fake," Caldwell said. His voice carried the particular quality of someone who has already made a decision and is now producing words to fit around it. Those four words, spoken by a 26-year-old officer in a strip mall parking lot in South Georgia, would eventually cost the city of Belleville more than $8 million. They would end 15 law enforcement careers. They would be read aloud in a congressional subcommittee hearing and quoted in 3 separate federal court filings. But none of that existed yet. What existed was the cold hood against my face, the plastic zip tie going around my wrists, and the sound of my federal credentials being dropped into an evidence bag with a noise like something being sealed away. The dashboard clock showed the time as they loaded me into the back of the cruiser. I watched it through the divider and committed the moment to memory the way my training had always taught me. Anchor every detail, because you may need to reconstruct it later in a room where someone is asking whether it was 1 minute or the next. I asked to speak to a supervisor 3 times on the drive over. Ramsey turned up the radio. Caldwell was telling him something about a game, a score, a quarter that had gone the wrong way. The streetlights of Belleville passed in slow orange intervals through the window. I sat with my hands behind my back and let the details accumulate. The route we took, the turns, the name of the detention center as it appeared on the building in block letters when we pulled into the lot. Belleville Municipal. At booking, Officer Granger took my phone. He took my watch. He took the backup ID in my wallet and the secondary marshal's credential I kept in a separate billfold in my inside jacket pocket for separate pieces of federal law enforcement identification, and he logged every one of them as unverified. I asked to make a phone call. He told me I could do that in the morning. I asked again, keeping my voice level, keeping my hands flat on the processing counter. He walked to the far end of the desk and began typing. I asked a 3rd time, and he looked up at last, slowly, with the patient tone of a man explaining something to a child. "You'll get your call in the morning." I did not get my call that night. The cell smelled of bleach, and beneath it something older and harder to name, the specific atmosphere of a room that has held people against their will night after night until the walls absorb it into the paint. I sat on the metal bench and pressed my back against the cinder block and made myself breathe slowly and all the way down. There was a crack in the paint above the door, a long diagonal line that someone had traced with a fingernail over and over until the layer beneath the white showed through in a pale gray groove. I stared at that crack for a long time. I thought about my mother. She had worked 30 years as an nurse at Grady Hospital in Atlanta. Double shifts, overnight holiday rotations. the full relentless weight of that job, so that her son could have a career that stood for something real and lasting. I thought about her face and felt something constrict in my chest that I would not let become grief. I thought about my supervisor, Calvin Pierce, who was going to have a very interesting morning. I thought about 12 years of service, the transport runs, the court escorts, the 3 times I had been shot at and the once I had actually been hit. The years of doing the job exactly as it was designed to be done correctly, quietly, and without complaint, and I felt something in me go still. Not the still of fear, the still of a man who has begun to do arithmetic, slowly and carefully. In his head, I sat in that cell for 9 hours and 43 minutes. When they returned my phone early the next morning, the screen lit up with 11 missed calls. 7 were from Calvin Pierce, 2 were from my office. 1 was from a number I did not recognize. When I called it back from the parking lot, while Officer Granger watched me from behind the glass with an expression that was already beginning to understand it had made a mistake. It turned out to be the regional director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Calvin Pierce had reached him late the night before, and he had spent the night making calls of his own. The first call I made was to Victoria Langford. She had been my attorney for 4 years. She was 53, a former federal prosecutor whose practice was built almost entirely around dismantling exactly these kinds of situations brick by brick, layer by layer, with the methodical patience of someone who had long ago stopped being angry and started being surgical. She picked up on the second ring. Despite the early hour, Malcolm, her voice was already awake, already focused, as if she had been waiting for this call. Tell me everything. Don't skip a single thing. I stood in the parking lot of the Belleville Municipal Detention Center in the same clothes I had been arrested in, the morning sun already beginning its work on the asphalt, and I told her everything. I did not skip a single thing. Victoria arrived in Belleville later, that morning. I had not expected her to drive down herself. It was a 4-hour trip from Atlanta, but she had not asked my opinion on the logistics. She pulled into the detention center parking lot in a silver Volvo, stepped out in a charcoal blazer and flat shoes, and walked toward me carrying a leather case that she held at her side like a weapon she had not yet decided to draw. She looked at my clothes, at the faint crease along my jaw where the hood of the cruiser had left its mark, and her expression did not change at all. That told me everything. Did they touch your service weapon? Was the first thing she said. Logged it as evidence. It's still inside. They disarmed you, processed you, and held you overnight while 4 pieces of federal law enforcement identification sat in their property room, she said quietly, not as a question, but as a sentence being assembled for a courtroom, and none of them made a single call to verify, not one. She looked at the building. The expression she wore was the one I had seen her put on before she walked into deposition, a focused stillness, the way a surgeon looks before the first incision. Good, she said, and then, we're going in. She retrieved my badge, my weapon, my watch, my phone, and my secondary credentials from a property officer who had the look of a man watching a natural disaster approach from a distance he could no longer trust. He signed every transfer form she placed in front of him in silence. When we walked back out into the parking lot, Victoria handed me my badge holder. I clipped it to my belt and stood there for a moment in the morning sun, feeling the specific weight of it settle against my hip. I thought about the 9 hours and 43 minutes during which it had been 3 feet away from me, behind a scratched plexiglass window. Where are we? I asked. I spoke with Gregory Shaw from the DOJ Civil Rights Division early this morning, she said. opening the Volvo's trunk and setting her case inside. He was already in motion. What you don't know yet because you were in a cell, that your supervisor ran your badge number through the federal verification system late last night and received direct confirmation in 4 minutes. For minutes, Malcolm, your credentials are real-time verifiable through a federal database that any law enforcement officer in this country can access from a squad car. They had the tools. They chose not to use them. I stood with that for a moment. The morning air smelled of cut grass and diesel from the road. Someone made a decision, I said. Someone's made several decisions, Victoria replied, and I'm going to find every single one of them. What I did not know then what Victoria would uncover in the weeks that followed, layer by careful layer, like peeling paint off a wall to find the rot underneath, was that night had not been a simple failure of protocol. It had been the visible surface of something that went deeper and older, something that had been accumulating inside the Belleville Municipal Police Department for years and had never been properly named, until the night they put a federal marshal in a cell and gave me 9 hours and 43 minutes to decide what I was going to do about it. The first layer was Officer Ramsey. His record, which Victoria obtained through discovery before the city's attorneys had time to fully appreciate what was coming, showed 7 prior complaints in 4 years on the force, 3 for excessive force, 2 for unlawful detention, 1 for failure to follow escalation protocol, and 1 filed by a black physician who had been stopped and detained in a hospital parking lot while wearing his scrubs and his ID badge around his neck. That complaint had been reviewed, filed, and closed with a notation of insufficient evidence to proceed. The officer who reviewed it had been Ramsey's direct supervisor, Lieutenant Harlan, who had spent 19 years in the department and regarded complaints the way a river regards a stone, something to be diverted around, smoothed over, and eventually forgotten. The second layer was Officer Caldwell. His personnel file contained something his supervisors had apparently found unremarkable, a field training evaluation from his 6th month that noted, in the measured language of bureaucratic euphemism, that he had demonstrated inconsistency in the application of de-escalation protocols when interacting with individuals of diverse backgrounds. The training officer who wrote that evaluation had recommended mandatory remedial training. The recommendation had been approved. The training had never been scheduled. The third layer, and this was the one that changed the temperature of everything, was the dashboard camera. Both officers' vehicles were equipped with dash cameras. Ramsey's had malfunctioned, or so the initial report stated. Caldwell's footage existed, but had not been preserved properly and would not be available for review. The department's Internal Affairs Office reported in a memo 3 days after my arrest, 1 day after Victoria had formally requested all video evidence in a certified letter sent simultaneously to the department's legal counsel, the chief of police, and the city attorney. Victoria called me on a Tuesday night in the weeks that followed. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Atlanta with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at nothing in particular, a habit I did not love but had not yet managed to stop. They erased Caldwell's dashcam footage, she said. The coffee cup was cold and smooth in my hand. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its nighttime business in the amber dark. When, I asked, based on the metadata the tech forensics team recovered from the device, the footage was overwritten the day after you were released, the day before my preservation letter arrived. Something shifted in my chest. Not surprised, some part of me had expected this, but a colder and more useful feeling. The feeling of a door closing and another one opening. Can they prove it was deliberate? They can prove the overwrite was manual, not automatic. The department's own policy requires dashcam footage to be preserved for a minimum of 90 days. Someone went into that system and deleted it by hand. Pause. And the server logs show. The login credentials belong to Lieutenant Harlan. I set the coffee cup down very carefully on the table and looked at it. Victoria, I know. That's obstruction? Yes, she said, with the clean, precise satisfaction of someone who has just placed the final piece of an argument. It is. The next 72 hours were the closest thing to a war room I had ever run outside of an actual federal operation. Victoria worked from her conference table in Atlanta with 3 associates and a forensic IT specialist. Calvin Pierce had by then formally escalated the matter to the U.S. Marshals Service's Office of Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility. Both had opened independent investigations. The DOJ Civil Rights Division had assigned 2 attorneys to the case. They were calls I was not on, meetings I was not in, conversations happening in federal buildings in Washington that would eventually produce consequences I could only partially imagine from where I sat. What I could do and what I did was build the timeline. I sat at my kitchen table every night that week with a legal pad and a pen and wrote down everything I remembered from that night. Not in the traumatized, circling way, had been going over it in my mind since it happened, the obsessive replays, the what-ifs. The moments where a different choice might have changed the outcome, but in the clean, factual, sequential way my training had drilled into me for 12 years. Time, location, statement, action, witness, the stamp of the clock on the dashboard, the names I had heard, the words I had committed to memory. The moment the badge hit the asphalt, the 4 words that had set everything in motion. I called my mother on a Thursday. She picked up before the second ring, the way she always did, as if she had been waiting. Malcolm. Her voice carried everything she was not going to say out loud. I'm okay. Mom, tell me. So I told her, the same way I had told Victoria, but warmer, slower, with more room in it. She listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could hear it. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Baby, she said finally, are you sure you want to do this? Because when you pull a thread like this, you don't know what comes with it. I know exactly what comes with it, I said. That's why I'm pulling it. Another silence. Then she said, your father would have to. She hung up before I could answer. I sat with that in the kitchen for a long time, the city outside the window, the cold coffee, the legal pad, the pen. 20 days after my arrest, the formal federal complaint was filed, 41 pages. It named officers Ramsey and Caldwell for unlawful arrest, use of excessive force, and violation of federal civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. It named Lieutenant Harlan for obstruction of justice and deliberate destruction of evidence. It named the Belleville Municipal Police Department for systemic failure to supervise, failure to train, and a documented pattern of discriminatory enforcement against black residents and visitors. It named the city of Belleville for institutional negligence in permitting the pattern to persist across multiple administrations. The complaint included the 7 prior complaints against Ramsey, the unscheduled remedial training that never happened for Caldwell, the server logs showing the manual deletion of dashcam footage, and a supplementary appendix that Victoria's team had compiled from public records requests 15 years of use of force reports from the Belleville Department, broken down by the race of the individual stopped. The numbers were not subtle. The city attorney reviewed the complaint on a Friday afternoon. I know this because Victoria's office received a call at 4:47 that same day. She told me later that she had been putting on her coat to leave when her phone rang. The city attorney, a man named Clifford Bennett, who had held the position for 11 years and who sounded, according to Victoria, like a man who had just been handed a bill he had not budgeted for, said he needed to speak with her about a potential path toward resolution. "How large is the path?" Victoria asked him. He named a number. Victoria told him to add a zero. He said that was impossible. She said she would see him in federal court in the spring. Then she put on her coat and went home. And Bennett spent the weekend calling the mayor. By the time we sat down at a conference table in Atlanta weeks later, the negotiations had been going on for 3 weeks and had already swallowed one preliminary offer that Victoria had declined without opening her laptop. Bennett was there. The mayor's chief of staff was there. The city council members sat along the wall saying very little. Victoria sat across from them with her associate and the 41-page complaint printed and bound in a black folder that she set on the table and did not open because she did not need to. She knew every page of it. So did they. 8.2 million, Victoria said after Bennett had finished speaking. She said it the way you state a fact, not the way you make a request. Paid to Malcolm Reed, non-negotiable, and the structural reforms. The reforms were the part Bennett had been hoping to avoid. They were, in Victoria's view, the point. The money was restitution. The reforms were the thing that might, if implemented fully and in good faith, mean that the next person who drove through Belleville with a federal badge would not spend the night in a cell while a night officer filed their credentials under unverified. She set a second document on the table, 12 pages, mandatory body camera policy with a 3-year retention requirement and tamper-evident logging, mandatory de-escalation training certification for every officer, renewed annually, an independent civilian oversight board with actual authority to review complaints and compel documentation, a direct protocol for federal credential verification, requiring any officer to run a badge number through the federal database within 10 minutes of a stop and to notify a supervisor immediately upon confirmation. The names of officers Ramsey, Caldwell, Lieutenant Harlan, and the 12 others implicated in the pattern, identified in the complaint's appendix, would be referred to the State Post Board for decertification. Review. Bennett looked at the document for a long time. 15 careers, he said quietly. It was not an objection. It was closer to accounting. They ended their own careers, Victoria said, her voice absolutely level. On that night and on every prior occasion when this department was informed of a problem and chose to do nothing about it. My client gave those officers every opportunity to do the right thing. I believe he gave them 3 separate verbal statements of his federal status. He showed them credentials. He asked to speak to a supervisor. He asked for a phone call. He was denied at every turn. The question of careers is not one I have much sympathy for at this particular table. The room was very quiet. Through the window of the conference room, Atlanta glittered in the cold light, silver and enormous. We'll need until January, Bennett said finally. You have until the 20th, Victoria said. I have a trial date. I will not move. They signed in mid-January. $8,200,000. All 15 officers referred for decertification. 12 of them lost their certifications within 90 days. 3, including Lieutenant Harlan, faced additional criminal referrals. Harlan was ultimately charged with obstruction and evidence tampering, pled to a reduced charge, and received 18 months of supervised probation, a fine, and a permanent bar from law enforcement employment. Ramsey's prior complaints were reopened by the State Post Board. He was decertified in the weeks that followed. Caldwell resigned before his review was completed and moved to a different state, which would not help him, because decertification is federal database reportable and follows you wherever you go. I returned to full duty a short time later. My first assignment was a transport run from Savannah to Charleston, a 5-hour round trip through Georgia coastal country, highway and marsh, and the particular pale winter light that sits on flat water at that time of year. Routine, quiet, unremarkable, exactly what I needed. On the drive back up to Atlanta afterward, I stopped at the same barbecue place in Belleville. I do not know exactly why. Maybe to prove something to myself, or maybe to close something that had been left open. The pulled pork was exactly the same. I got the peach cobbler again. I sat in a corner booth and ate slowly, and watched the evening traffic on the 4-lane boulevard outside. Ordinary and indifferent hand, I thought about my mother's voice on the phone saying, "Your father would have to," and the way that sentence had landed in my chest and stayed there. My father had been a civil rights attorney in Atlanta for 31 years before he died. He had sat at tables like the one we had sat at and put documents in front of people who did not want to read them and waited with perfect stillness until they did. I paid the check and walked out to my car. The evening air was cold and clean with the specific clarity of a Georgia winter that has not yet decided whether it wants to be winter or spring. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. My badge was on my hip where it belonged. The parking lot was lit the same orange as it had been that night, the same tree line at the edge, the same geometry of light and asphalt. Different night, different man. I drove back to Atlanta with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and for the first time in months, the silence in the car felt like mine.